You're listening to 94.4 FM Salford City Radio, the Friday Sports Show.
You're listening to Salford City Radio 94.4 FM with your host Jimmy Petruzzi, bringing you news from the local area and around the world. We bring Salford to the world and the world to Salford. We're very fortunate in the show. We've interviewed some of the world's best athletes, sports people, footballers, people who work in sport across a wide range of disciplines, trainers, sports scientists, you name it. They've been on the show. We've also got a segment where we speak to some of the most influential people in the world of psychology who've been very kind to give us their thoughts on mental health and related fields. So we're very fortunate to get international perspectives on the show, and today's guest is probably as well placed than anybody to talk about what it's like to play in different countries. He's played football and coached in England, in Scotland, in Australia, and he's got a vast amount of experience of playing and coaching. I'm sure he'll give us a really fascinating insight into what it's like to play in different countries, and also the challenges, the highlights of being in different environments. Mark Robertson, welcome to the show. Great to have you on board.
Thanks, Jimmy. I really appreciate it, mate, and thank you very much for the warm welcome. It's always nice to for someone else to run through the accolades and a little bit about my history, so thank you very much for the introduction.
Yeah, I mean, for our listeners, Mark, tuning in, and our listeners range from people who sort of play professional sport to people who just generally, the goal is we try and increase awareness, participation of sport as well. And where did it all begin for you, Mark? I mean, you got this incredible career where you've played in so many places, and no doubt you've had many great experiences. But where did the football journey start for yourself?
So it's kind of initially born and raised in Australia, and I think that that alone sets me aside from a lot of different people from different countries because our country's so multicultural and the opportunity that we have to play so many different sports, you're almost blessed to be able to, I guess, grow up with the fundamentals of playing sport and learning a little bit about sport. So that curtailed with my father, who was a professional athlete as well. He was a former Socceroo. He played for the Australian national team. He was a professional footballer in Scotland himself. So I guess simplicity for me was knowing a little bit about sports, was knowing having that competitive edge and a competitive drive that most Australian players or sports and athletes and children in general have. Just putting all that together with the combination of, like I said, the genes of my father being a footballer. It was quite simple for me to then get involved in football, and I did so in Australia to the highest level. But when you get that ceiling point in Australia and you've reached the highest level, I think most players, most coaches, anybody with ambition is just looking to drive to that little bit of a further step in their career, and I was no different. So I ventured abroad after playing some good tournaments with the Australian under-20 side. I was thankful enough to have a couple of clubs in Europe vying for my signature, mainly Glasgow Rangers, Nottingham Forest, and Burnley Football Club. So, I was blessed in that sense. I had worked extremely hard in Australia to become what I did become as a footballer. Back in those days, it was only part-time, so I was only training, say, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or vice versa days, and so the rest of my days were made up of either going to school or when I'd finished school, doing my own park runs. I lived near Maroubra Beach, so I'd do a lot of soft sand running, and I would get to the gym and do my swimming and all the little bits and pieces that I talk to young athletes about these days is just doing the extras and not jumping up and down and telling everyone about it, but doing it for yourself first and foremost. And so that's a long-winded answer, but being brought up in Australia was a blessing for me. It gave me the opportunity to sample many different sports and just have that feel-good vibe about living outdoors and then picking up on that competitive edge, as I mentioned, that most Australians have got.
Absolutely. And at what point did you realise, Mark, you had something? I mean, in terms of, was there a point where you felt, okay, I've got to as high as I can go in Australia now, I'm going to test myself overseas? And at what point did you think, I've got a chance here. You believe you could do it.
Yeah, so I was lucky in a sense because I went into a first team environment. I was playing in the men's game at the age of 15. So by the time 15 and 16 had come, I'd been in the men's changing room and I understood what it took to be a professional footballer. So I think to answer your question, around about 17, I joined Marconi Fairfield in the west of Sydney.
Yeah.
It used to take me a long time to get there. I lived in Maroubra at the time, and we didn't have the M5 motorways and stuff. So it was all the windy roads through Auburn and stuff to get there. So once I'd done that and I started training with elite players, because up until then I was really just local and playing National Premier League and stuff like that. But I think once I started mixing with, NSL players back then, which is now the A-League, I kind of realised, I thought, wow, I'm just as good as these guys, and if not better than some of them. And look, the game's all about self-belief, isn't it?
Absolutely.
For me, it's the most important key facet of the game is self-confidence. And I'm not saying I was arrogant, but I was certainly highly confident in my own ability. I just needed someone to give me a chance, and when they gave me that chance, I kind of grabbed the ball and, as we say, run with it.
Brilliant, brilliant. And then you experience sort of overseas. I mean, what was the level like? I mean, obviously a lot of great players, particularly around your sort of generation in Australia. Some really, really good players, and I'm sure some of our listeners will be familiar with some of the players who've gone through Marconi. There's been a fair few who've sort of made their mark on the world in that respect. But what was it like to sort of play overseas? What was the difference in standard like for yourself?
Yeah, so one thing I will say is the nation, which is the United Kingdom, which I chose to ply my trade, was very high level of intensity. It was technically okay at the time. It was more intense than it was technical for me. So I had no problem with like the unopposed stuff at training. Let's say our passing drills and so forth. I think the biggest problem I had was when it come into your possessions and your small-sided games at training, and then into 11v11. I really found a massive impact on me as a player because of the intensity. So instead of taking your 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 touches like you would in Australia, it was limited. It was limited down to keep that ball moving as quick as you can. I remember my manager, who was a fantastic world-class footballer, just turning around to me and saying, "Robbo, you can't take those touches there." And all I was doing in midfield was receiving the ball, turning, lifting my head and looking forward. But, I was it was taught out of me, if that makes sense, to express myself and more to join in the way of the standard of football in the UK, which was a passing game. So, look, if I had my time again, and I know this is a little bit silly to say, I would have loved a chance to be on the continent and continue to play football, because I look at some of the football I was playing in Australia, and it was nice. It was nice, attractive football. I had players around me, Ufuk Talay, Steve Corica, these sort of guys that were all playing football. So to go to the UK was a real shell shock. And look, in the end, I've got no regrets, because I had a great career and done some great things with my life in football. But yeah, I always wonder how I would have went if I had have went onto the continent and maybe had a sample of your Holland, Belgium, Italy, something along those lines. But intensity, mate. The key factor was intensity in making split-second decisions, because fitness was never going to be a problem. I was always the fittest player at every club I went to.
Wow, yeah.
It was more split-second decision-making and making the right decision at the right time.
That's a really interesting point you make there about the fitness, Mark. I find it really interesting because, one thing I think for players, it's really important if they sort of, if whether they're coming from Australia to the UK or Europe or anywhere else for that matter, it's a variable that you can work on and be the best you can be. Did you sort of consciously sort of say, I'm going to get myself as fit as I can possibly, so when I turn up to a club, I'm going to sort of stand out, or at least for some players who might not have your genetics, to be able to do that, to at least be the best you can be, and you don't really want to be left behind, miles behind. You just want to set a great impression. Is that you sort of thought, I'm going to make sure I go there and I'm super fit?
100%, and you only really need to go back to bigger legends and people that achieved way more in the game than what I did, and Craig Johnson was the perfect example. He recalls having to be and wanting to be and being the fittest player at every football club he went to, so that when that opportunity come to him, whether it had been at Middlesbrough or Liverpool, or he was scrounging around for trials here, trials there. So when he got his opportunity, he felt like he could compete. He felt he had the capacity to run as hard as anyone, as tackle as hard as anyone. So, and it's all about repetitiveness. So if you can do it on a repetitive occasion, which is your being fit, then you've got every chance of your ability. Look, you can't work on your ability overnight. That takes years and years and years. But one thing I believe that you can work on and chip away at every day to improve is definitely your fitness. And I find it bizarre that anybody would look to go into a club, a trial, or sign for that club and not be ahead of the game. Because at the end of the day, there's a saying in football, you have to be better than what they've got for them to sign you. Now, if you're not fitter than what they've got, you've got no chance. If you're not better than what they've got, you've got no chance. And one thing that people need to understand is these guys are actually paying you money. Now, when we all go to the shops and buy something, we keep the receipt. Unfortunately, with football, you don't get a receipt. You buy the player, you pay the player, and if they're a flop, then that comes down to a magnitude of different reasons for that. So I always appreciated the money that I got for playing, and I wanted to work extremely hard to repay the faith that everybody gave me.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. I think any sort of young player, or any player of any age listening, it's an important takeaway there to sort of get them. And I think these days, with so much information out there, there's no real excuse not to get yourself to at least do some fitness tests and see where you're up to before you go to a club and get an idea of where you need to be. That's for sure. And in terms of yourself, some of the highlights, Mark, what's some of the highlights that you've had in obviously you played for a number of clubs, and what would you say some of the highlights that you've had sort of playing overall?
You can only really break it down into two segments. I think for any footballer to be a professional is extremely rewarding, satisfactory levels that you get for it is unbelievable. Then the next stage of your career after becoming a professional is playing for your country. So for me, the two most important things that I ever achieved was A, becoming that professional footballer, and B, playing for my country and being so proud to do so. Then if you break the club situation down and you go into the clubs that I played for, I played for some massive clubs with great history. So playing for Dundee, I had the opportunity to play in Europe. I had the opportunity to compete against some of the best clubs in the world, in Celtic and Rangers, in front of 65,000 people. I played for Burnley, which competed in the FA Cup, the League Cup. We had a great run in all of those. And, when I was at Burnley, we got promoted to the Championship, which was fantastic and an achievement that I was part of. So to break the football down with the nation, I was lucky enough to captain my country at a very young age in the under 20s. Then went on to represent the under 20s, the under 23s, and then made my full national debut, which was nice. Playing for the Socceroos was always a dream of mine, and to get there and to be able to do that was a blessing and something that I cherish dearly. And I always speak to people so fondly about it. My time playing for my country.
No, absolutely. And in terms of playing international football, Mark, for our sort of listeners, what would you say the difference is when you sort of play international football? Obviously, you play at a very high level over here, and you're no stranger to sort of tough competitive games, the likes of Burnley and Dundee. But sort of playing at international level, what would you say the main difference is when you sort of step out there and you sort of play for your country and you're playing international football?
I think you're playing against the best of the best, and the most inspiring thing for anybody to play for their nation is that you know that you're playing with the best of the best of your country. So these are guys that are playing with passion and patriotism for their club, for their country. So anytime you play against someone who's playing for their country, I think they do raise their level by at least 20% because their country's involved, the emotional tie for people and those sort of things. So for me, I just think that you're playing against the best of the best. Not to say you aren't at club level, but I just think playing against a squad of players that are all from the same country who all share the same values of the crest that's on their chest and what it means to play for their country. I just think that was extremely rewarding to turn around and say, right, I'm Argentina today. I know that every single one of them are Argentinian. I know exactly what they're going to be about, and then just playing against a different brand of football. So Argentina to Australia, obviously we had to adapt our style of play to be able to match with Argentina, and playing against Hungary or Canada or Tunisia or these are just like teams that we had to adjust our game plan to play against, and I think that's the best challenge I had as a footballer, is being able to do that.
That's really interesting. And in terms of sort of yourself, you sort of make it as a professional football, and then making it is one thing, but then sort of staying in there and having a career as long as yourself. I mean, just for sort of some of the younger listeners, sort of making their way in the game. I mean, what I know it's difficult. Everyone's sort of on their own journey, but what did you do, Mark, to sort of keep yourself in? Did you sort of work extra? Obviously, staying in the game professionally is not easy. There's certainly, if you want to be a professional footballer, keeping in there. But was it like, did you work extra as well, or did you? What sort of do you think kept you in the game for so long?
I just reminded myself daily, Jimmy, that I'd come a long way to achieve what I wanted to achieve. So, and I passed this on to my son, who's now a professional footballer, and I pass it on to many of the younger generations, is just remember why you're getting out of bed in the morning. Some people get out of bed in the morning to win trophies. Other people get out of bed in the morning to earn money. I just made sure that every time I got out of bed, I just reminded myself that I've come 12,000 miles away from Maroubra Beach to Europe to become a footballer. And I think that should be enough of a drive on its own, let's say, for people to then turn around and have the motivation to want to do well. And I was up against players that were living in their hometowns. So that alone, there was no real stress for them because they'd go home at the weekend, but this international weekend coming up now, there's 4 days off. My son will come back to our home, whereas I didn't have a home. So for those 4 days international break, I didn't go anywhere. I sort of just stayed around in the area that I was in. I couldn't go visit family because my family were on the other side of the world. So I think that alone was a massive drive for me, just to know that I could compete with people that were born and raised here, and I just kept reminding myself that what I needed to do to stay at the top.
And do you think that sort of contributed to making you strong sort of mentally as well, Mark, not just in football but in life in general, to sort of to be across the other side of the world, and like you've mentioned there, you got local players who sort of got their support network around them, and they have a bad game, they've got people around them straight away they can immediately sort of talk to it. Things, obviously football has many twists and turns in the career, but do you think being in that sort of situation, it was like, from a mental strength point of view, how did that contribute to yourself outside the game as well too, or?
Yeah, definitely. Look, it's no secret that whenever you retire from professional sport, you do have a little bit of a slump. But now that I've gone through the slump and I've come out the other side, and I look at life after football, I look back with fond memories on what I'd achieved within the game. But now I feel like I could take on the world. It's like there's no job big enough now that would put me off taking it on board and just trying to be really successful at it, because I feel like I've done the hard yards. I've already done the training, I've done the fitness, I've done the mental preparation to try and be at the highest level. So I've done all that. So now for me, I feel like any challenge that I go into, I'm ready to take it head on. And I do that on a daily basis. I do that in the corporate world. I do that in football arenas, and even just speaking to yourself today, Jimmy, you've got to have a confidence about you. You've got to believe in what you say, and that usually comes through knowledge. It comes through experience. And to answer your question, I feel great in the way of having that mental strength to take on anything that I do these days. Yeah,
that's interesting too. And I suppose, the generation when you played, the world these days, Mark, is probably a smaller place in the sense you've got sort of, obviously, social media, people can sort of switch on and see, what goes on in the world, pretty much quicker than sort of years gone by. For yourself, was it important to sort of embrace the sort of culture and sort of, obviously, you play for teams that may not have been, some of the teams you played for may not have been in the bigger cities, for example, where you've got more of a sort of city environment. But do you feel it was important to sort of just embrace the culture and where you were and sort of adapt to the environment you were in?
Yeah, definitely. My first club was Burnley Football Club, which has a population of within Burnley, a population of around about, back then, was about 62,000 people. Yeah. So to have one of their own living in the town was something that they probably weren't all that used to, because a lot of the boys would live outside of Burnley and they would travel to training. But I decided to live inside the town, and as you said, just acclimatise to life in England. And look, you adapt quite quickly. It's a sink or swim sort of environment that you have to be able to hold a conversation in a changing room. Now, if you think about it, you put 20, 30 guys together, they're all going to have different opinions, they're all going to have different lifestyles, they're all going to have different things that are happening within their life. So there's many different conversations that you can have. So I've spoke to my son about this when I'm doing some mentoring, is you can't just sit and talk about rap music every day. You can't sit and talk about social media every day. You may have to go into politics. You may have to go into investment. You just got to have like a broader sort of range of social skills when you go into these environments, because I believe that if you don't, it's very hard to not be welcomed, but very hard for you to get into the inner circle and just, be appreciated a little bit more than what you would if you just wanted to go in and talk about Adidas trainers or something like that. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I guess in one sense too, in terms of for yourself, Mark, maybe being in Burnley, maybe inverse to say being in a London where that there are a lot of other things going on. In one sense, you sort of just put your head down and really focus on the game. We've sort of seen in years gone by, maybe not so much now, but certainly in years gone by, we've seen players move to certain places, and sometimes the distractions off the field can sort of get in the way of their career. Do you find that sometimes if you can start at a club where I can just get my head down and just really focus on my football and just build on that?
Yeah, definitely, and that's something that I speak to a lot of young players about. Hence the reason why my son is playing and living in Inverness, which is as far up North Scotland as you could go for a city, and again, population of around 70,000 people, and again, that was me just looking at it and saying, right, what's best for his career? For his career is leaving Manchester for a period of time, getting out of the big smoke of the city lights, and going and knuckling down. And look, the distractions are the hardest part away from football. The distractions when you're at the training ground and at the stadium, they're okay. They're not bad, because everybody's in the same environment. You all earn good money, and you all have the right the right vibes and what you want to achieve. It's when you walk outside of there and you start to invite people into your circle or invite them in to have conversations with you, I think that's when the problem starts. So to limit that, living in a less populated town, city, whichever way you want to look at it, you're always going to have your downfalls, and you're going to have people that will be negative. I just feel like in the smaller environments, as you said, you get the opportunity to concentrate more on your football and what you want to achieve personally, as opposed to living in the bigger city and then looking to try and do other things away from the football.
Absolutely, and especially I suppose, we sort of sometimes see it's interesting you say that, Mark, because sometimes you sort of see players and they've had a season or two and they kind of think they've made it, but then you just got to keep going and football, I suppose, it's the consistency to keep going is key. And I suppose just for our younger listeners, how important do you think it is to be consistent year in, year out if you truly want a career in the game as a professional?
Wow, consistency is the biggest word there, Jimmy, and forget about year in, year out. It's day in, day out, because your footballing life can change so quickly, and that's for the better, the worse, and it all depends on what you turn out on a daily basis. I always say it's no fluke that the same sort of people end up dwindling away in their career because of that reason, because of consistency. You can be a nice little flash in the pan one week and everyone thinks, wow, he's terrific, but then the next week you can't maybe hold the nerve, or you don't know what you've done the week before, which made you stand out. Some people don't even know what it is that makes them stand out. I think my biggest component to sort of teaching people is know what you're good at, stick to it. Try not to divert too far off track with it, but then also look to try and work on your strengths as well, and your weaknesses, because ultimately we all have weaknesses, but I'm always trying to tell people to concentrate on what you're good at as opposed to what you're not good at, and then you'll have some nice positive vibes about you.
Absolutely. And in terms of yourself, one of the sort of questions I ask many of our guests is I know you sort of mentioned it before about maybe playing on the continent, but if you were to sort of speak to younger self, Mark, starting out again, what would you sort of say to your younger self starting out on this sort of on this sort of adventure, the journey of playing professionally as a footballer, and obviously going on to coach and mentor and other things? What would you sort of say at the beginning to the younger self?
I think the most honest way of me answering that, Jimmy, is, I wanted to be, and I tried to be the best player I could when I was playing for Marconi. I then moved abroad, and it took me a little while to adjust, but I'm just looking back on it and thinking back through our conversations that we're having now. You need to have the same desire as what you had when you were 17, when you're 27. Now, if you don't have that, there's every chance that you will just be one of those footballers that just has an okay career and just does enough. So what I would tend to say, and look back on it, and I would love to say that to myself again, is if I could have carried the same mentality and physicality as what I did from Australia throughout my whole career, and I mean that in the way of I wanted to be the best at Marconi. Then I went to Burnley, and maybe you question yourself, am I the best? What I would rather say is, how do I break it down to be the best? Now, players are playing at the likes of Manchester City and Manchester United. You can't have a pessimistic mindset to say I'll never play for that football club. For me, I think it's about how do I play for that football club, as opposed to will I ever play for that football club. So
that's really powerful.
To a younger self, how will I play for that football club, and how will I be the best at this football club, would always be on my forefront of my mind. Whereas I think when I was coming through, I was really happy to be a professional footballer, and yes, I worked hard, but I never really looked at it as if to say, how can I be the best at this football club? And I wish that had have continued thinking more along those lines when I was younger.
That's really powerful, Mark. That's really interesting insight. That's for sure. I'm sure a lot of our younger listeners will be listening to that, thinking, thinking that that's quite a powerful way of looking at things. I guess the other side of things. I mean, obviously you're a mentor as well. You've got a lot of experience in sort of working with players. I think the other side of it too. I mean, I think the tough thing about football is there's only so many places, and with yourself, obviously, you had the talent and the attributes, the pace, the physicality to play. Do you think there's a point in everyone's career where they sort of have this realization and just, okay, well, I found my level as well? Maybe that might be semi-pro, that might be lower league or high, whichever league they end up. But is there a point also, do you think, for some players, Mark, where they've just got to hold their hands up and say, what, given everything, maybe I'm just, for whatever reason, just not going to make that professional game?
I would try and steer away from ever admitting where you are up to until you've retired.
Great
I think
point.
Only then you can look back on your career and say, well, I look back on my career and how can I justify that I should have played at a better level when I didn't play at a better level? Albeit within myself, when I was going through the journey, I wanted to play at a better level, and I felt like I should have played at a better level. But one thing I would always say to youngsters is when you finish and when you retire, you can then look back and then you can sit back and say, right, well, that's my what I had as a career, and I look back on it, and I there's probably nothing more I could have done to change that. But I certainly wouldn't ever look at it if I was playing semi-professional football in Australia. I would never go through my years and then go, well, this is it, this is my ceiling point, because the moment you do that, you take your foot off the gas, and then unfortunately, who's to be the dream buster? Who's to pop people's bubble to say that they aren't good enough? And I go through this a lot with some of the young players, is you believe you will be where you be come the end of your career. And it's no different to a football club, the English Premier League, who sits at the top of the league come the end of the season, is the best football team. When you finish playing your career, then look back on it, and then you can say, well, this is what happened to me, and this is how it happened. And that's all I do when I'm sharing my stories with people like yourself. Don't ever doubt yourself. Don't ever pull yourself back and say, this is me, this is my ceiling point. Just keep striving, because you just never know who's watching. And
absolutely,
as a scout right now, I watch thousands of games a year, so maybe I am watching these players that are listening. Maybe there's other people watching these players that are listening, and I've plucked a few players out from lower levels, and I've put their names forward to such big clubs as Manchester City, and people have sat up and thought, well, if Mark Robertson's sending us these names, then they must be half decent. And I don't know these players. I've never met them before. I don't know anything about them, but I just look at their core values, their body language, how they carry themselves, what their abilities like, what the ability to work without the ball just as much as with the ball. And there's some key attributes that someone can have in their football career.
Yeah, and that's really powerful, Mark. I think that's a great point that certainly listeners will take a lot out of, especially the younger performers, where you just keep going, keep being the best you can be, and then just assess things at the end of the career and see where you are. And absolutely, and I suppose it's one of them where you just never know what team needs which player position wise. You've got to be in it to win it, really. And that's the thing as well, Mark. And just on the final, I mean, how important is it for players to make sure you're prepared, if you get the opportunity? Because sometimes I feel that certain players that maybe, like you said, they might take their foot off the gas, and the opportunity comes up and they're not ready for it. How key do you think it is to be ready for as and when the chance comes up to showcase your ability?
Yeah, well, physicality and mentality are married together. They have to be. There's no point in you having, a body like a Greek god and then a mindset that doesn't believe that you are the Greek god. Do you know what I mean? So that's something that I really push down towards any athlete that I speak to, is be a believer. Be a believer that you're mentally at the right place and that you're physically at the right place. don't just look after one and not the other, because the two of them are married together. They need to be in this day and age, because talent alone is not going to get you through. So I would really suggest that working hard physically, working hard mentally, and then most of all having that self-belief to know that you're the conduit between the two of them, and marry them together so that you can have the most successful football career or the most successful work career that you can, no matter what your background is.
No, absolutely, that's great, Mark. It's been really kind of you to join us. I found it really fascinating. No doubt the listeners have found that really interesting and informative, that's for sure. So I really want to thank you for coming aboard the show and sharing your experiences, and also giving us an insight into your own sort of career and what you do. So thanks for coming aboard the show. It was great to speak to you.
My pleasure, Jimmy, and thanks for reaching out to invite me on. As always, I enjoy sharing my knowledge and experiences in the hope that it helps some of the listeners to then go on and achieve what they would like to achieve throughout their lives.
Absolutely. That was Mark Robertson, who's been there and done that as a footballer. I think, certainly for our listeners who play the game, it's been an interesting insight. And even if you don't play the game or you play a different sport, there's some really great takeaways from that interview about believing in yourself and sort of keeping going. And I suppose there are lessons to be learned also, not just in sport but outside sport. I'm sort of thinking about apply some of these sort of concepts even in sort of general working life as well. So as Mark Robertson, who's kind enough to join us, who's played in many different parts of the world, on Salford City Radio 94.4 FM. Friday Sports Show, your host, Jimmy Petruzzi.